Okay, so let's end our discussion of Freud's theory by talking a bit about his contributions and also some critiques of his theory. The contributions listed here over on the left include the idea that we as human beings do have unconscious motives and wishes that influence our behavior. Also, that there is a role of sexual and aggressive impulses during childhood. It's important to note here that when Freud talks about sexual impulses, he isn't necessarily referring to the idea of having sex. He's not saying that infants and toddlers and very young children are looking to have sex. Instead, he used this in a much broader sense to describe the fact that infants and young children um, take pleasure in contact with other people. And we know that's true. We know, for example, if infants don't have contact with other people, if you put an infant alone in a room and they have no contact, that affects them negatively, both in their physical and cognitive development. Um, Another contribution is the idea of focusing on the family's impact on development and attempting to explain how children translate these demands created by these interpersonal relationships with the world around them into their own way, their own internal way of functioning. This three parts of personality, and the superego being the demands created by society is translated through family and peers, and that gets mediated by the ego, and that develops a personality. He was really the first one to suggest these different ways of thinking of things. Some of the critiques of his theory include this overemphasis on sexuality, the idea that his theory was developed in 19th century Victorian society, which was very restrictive. So the idea that a lot of the ideas were specific to that time period. He never directly studied children. A lot of his ideas about children came from his work with adults who had neuroses, a very specific population, and having them talk about their childhoods. And a lot of his concepts weren't well supported by scientific research. Remember, he was a clinician. He was working with patients. Psychology was a different sort of field in terms of methodology back then. Um, so it turns out when you try to test out many parts of his theory, a lot of them don't get supported. Okay, we'll wind up there and we'll move on to our next theory.